Hello and welcome to another audio edition of the Attunement Emissary Legacy Series. My name is Gary Goodhue, and I'll be your host. In this episode, we're going to be working with a beautiful little piece titled The Art and Science of Living. This piece was brought forth by Martin Cecil in 1973. It's actually a spoken piece that was audio recorded and then later transcribed and then added into the book On Eagle's Wings as a chapter under the same name, The Art and Science of Living. If you weren't aware, Martin was actually the second leader of the Emissaries of Divine Light. Him and Yolanda were close friends back in the 50s, and when Yolanda died, Martin took over that role of leadership, and for the next 30 years almost, the ministry flourished. It expanded to have communities all across the world and became very, very popular, carrying forth the spiritual intentions on the foundation that Yolanda brought and set forth. And if you have listened to the previous piece that we worked with, which was a talk by Yolanda titled Be Yourself, Yolanda brought forth this concept that we are either a living soul or a dying soul. And I chose this piece to follow up with it because Martin goes a little more in depth on this topic of the art and science of living. So that if we are to be living souls, what are some of the things that help us move in that direction, or some of the things that kind of take us out of that into being focused more as a dying soul? So even though Martin doesn't use those specific words, he does refer to living and dying. That's a context that I have going into it and want to invite everyone else into, because Martin's talk is going to enrich our entire paradigm of looking at this important topic as if it was a subject for education. And so that's the angle that he's coming from in this piece. And just to share with you, as you're about to listen to this audio recording, Martin has this way where he's kind of slow starting out. And I just mean that like in his voice pitch and his cadence. And then he really starts picking up speed like a freight train. And before you know it, for me, I was just enthralled listening to his words and the style of how he presents. Just like our other audio recording pieces, after we're done, I'm going to come back in and just highlight some of the topics that he brought forth and kind of do a little condensing and sum up for all of us. After an hour of listening, so many different points get brought up, it's nice to have a refresher at the end of everything that we just experienced. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Martin Cecil on the art and science of living.
What a beautiful morning on this 7th day of January 1973. You'll note I've got my warm tie on this morning. The sun is shining brightly in a blue sky, but it's cold. At least 30 degrees below zero last night, I presume, and still 20 degrees below now. But we have braved the elements and are assembled in the chapel. To give consideration to the art and science of living. It is remarkable how little consideration is given to this subject in the world as we know it. Much is considered in the curriculum of the high school and in university, but at least in the public sector of things, no interest seems to be displayed in the art and science of living. No courses, but whether this subject is taught or not, we find ourselves under the necessity of remaining alive for a few years Why is there such a lack of interest in this particular area? Principally, I suppose, because there are so few qualified teachers, and also because, perchance, it might interfere with what people want to do with themselves. It might be discovered, for instance, that there are very definite rules and regulations if life is to be experienced, and human beings are not too happy about such things. They want to have what they call freedom. Freedom to do as one pleases. This is permissible while life remains, but if this so-called freedom is exercised, life doesn't remain very long. Because there are these rules and regulations. Should they be ignored, then disease, death, and disaster ensue. We ourselves have presumably acknowledged the truth of this, but the question is as to how much real interest has been displayed both in gaining a deeper understanding of the art and science of living and also a deeper experience of it. As I've indicated, all too many people endeavor to avoid any consideration in this regard in case it might interfere with the way they want to conduct their own affairs. Undoubtedly, it would interfere. But how foolish to follow the path which inevitably leads into trouble, rather than to turn attention toward a discovery of what life is really all about. Presumably, we spend an hour or two a week investigating this area, and we are examined and graded 24 hours a day the rest of the week. Now, whether a person studies the subject or not, he is still examined and graded during the hours of his weekly experience. In high school or university, it is recognized that there must be a way of determining whether a person has learned anything. And so there are various kinds of examination. Which must be passed if one is to continue to experience the greater education. But in the area of life's examination, there is failure, as evidenced by many things, by all the troubles which human beings experience. Because of this, human beings have a sense of failure. It may not be clearly recognized as to why it's there, or even clearly recognize that it is there, but subconsciously there is this sense of failure, a sense of lack, a sense of inadequacy. And of course, this is uncomfortable. So various methods are used to try to dispose of it. All this confused state of affairs in human experience is, as we well know, consequent upon the fact that man, male and female, has become separated from the universal whole. Human beings individually feel themselves to be isolated. But the fact of the matter is that the whole of mankind is isolated. It has isolated itself from participation in the overall operation of the universal whole. Some say this is a separation from God. That may be one way of describing the situation. but it's a fact. Human beings, for the most part, have little awareness that they really are a part of even this little hole here on the surface of the planet. Man has been acting as though he was separate and apart from what is usually called nature. He can stand in his exalted position, apparently, according to his own view at least, and observe nature, as though he himself wasn't a part of nature. Because of this false positioning, he sees everything in a very distorted fashion. And apparently his central interest relates to how he may live with himself, that is, human beings may live with each other, set up some sort of a society, and all the relationships that are in that society so as to make man content. Here is obvious isolation, mankind completely encased in plastic and separate from the rest of the universe. Of course, he finds now, particularly, that he has to take into account some of nature because it is necessary to his continued existence. But if he could dispense with nature on the surface of this planet and continue to exist and to be in a condition of satisfactory relationship within the body of mankind, he would do it. In other words, there's no awareness of the fact that he is a part of anything more than mankind. Whereas a little common sense immediately indicates that mankind couldn't exist at all if it wasn't for the fact that there is a planet to exist on. And therefore the fact of the planet is an important point, and the planet would not be a suitable habitation for man if it was not in correct relationship with the sun, at least. So immediately there is an obvious connection between man and the solar system. He's not quite so sure as to what the connection might be between the solar system and the galaxy, but obviously the solar system is a part of the galaxy. In any case, man has this isolationist viewpoint. And individually speaking, we find ourselves also in isolation. All because of the failure to pass the examination and to reach the necessary grades in the art and science of living. And so individually speaking, we feel somewhat alone, isolated, lonely. Now this sense of isolation is an indication of the fact that there is a need to be restored to proper relationship to the universal whole. This is what this individual human loneliness means. But this is not the way that human beings interpret it. Because a person feels lonely and isolated, he looks around for something or someone to fill the void. And in this attitude, if he is successful in discovering someone who more or less satisfactorily for the moment seems to fill that void, he has thereby defeated his own movement toward maturity or the true experience of living. Human beings are mutually parasitic in this sense. The person feels the emptiness inside himself. How is it going to be filled, he says. Well, I must have a friend, he says. So he looks around to find someone who will more or less fill the requirement of this void. But if he preys upon somebody else in this fashion, and presumably if there is a mutual affinity here, the other person is preying upon the first person, all movement toward the experience of the art and science of living ceases. The individual cannot mature, because the only way by which maturity comes, and one may become aware of the truth of oneself, is by letting it fill the void from within oneself. In other words, there is no one who can permit the void in you to be filled except you. And if you try to get someone else to do it, you prevent yourself from experiencing what it would mean to let that void be filled. This emptiness in you can only be filled by you, not by anybody else. If interest is turned toward the art and science of living, this is one of the first things that becomes apparent. Those who are trying to fill the voids in themselves by using other people, it's not always other people, it's things too, to try to fill themselves up in this regard, so that this gnawing loneliness is taken away. They completely frustrate what is essential in the experience of living, and they become addicted to whatever it is that they think is necessary to fill the void in themselves. So that a person imagines that if whatever it is he has chosen to fill the void in himself was taken away, that it would be a terrible thing, it would be disaster. You couldn't live anymore. Now, sometimes in the field of what is called love, this idea is very strong. That people say, well, I couldn't live without so-and-so. The point is that the person can't live with so-and-so, actually. because it is completely frustrating the experience of the art and science of living. Now, this seems totally contradictory to the human consciousness, because after all, we have to get along together, we have to have relationships, we have to have friends. Oh, yes, that's true. But on what basis? If it is based in the fact that one is lonely, and therefore is trying to fill one's void of loneliness by using other people and other things, he must remain in a very childish state, never experiencing what it means to live, never experiencing the truth of himself. It is impossible on that basis, because he has blocked the very thing that should be the connecting point with the truth of life itself. If you assuage your loneliness on this basis, you destroy yourself. And yet this is what everybody's trying to do. A complete violation of the rules and regulations of life. And if you violate the rules and regulations of life, you stop living. Now, it's a more or less gradual process, and people don't realize what's happening. Some do wake up somewhere along the way and say to themselves, what on earth have I been doing? Well, then, they may have some little interest in the art and science of living and can begin to find out how it works. Now, presumably in other fields of education, people are all interested in finding out how various things work. But life? And yet how quickly people establish habit patterns and addictions early in life, out of which they find it virtually impossible to come later on. There's a problem of drug addiction and alcohol addiction in the world. These are the main areas that are considered to be addiction. But there is addiction in every direction. Almost everything that human beings do is based in their addictions. They are controlled by these addictions. Oh, I couldn't live without this, and without that, and without the other person. That's an addiction, obviously. Because the fact of the matter is, until first things are put first, the person cannot live. Emphasis has been placed on what has been called the first great commandment, because this refers to what is first necessary. When what is first necessary is considered as being first, then everything else can fall into place. Because the individual will not be looking around anymore to assuage his own sense of isolation and loneliness. There isn't a human being on the face of the earth who does not have this sense of isolation and loneliness. And because of this, which is present, he tries desperately to fill it up. And how few people will pay any attention to the true way of allowing this experience of living to come. They want to fill these things up in their own way, according to their own ideas of what they think they want, of what they think is necessary. If it seems as though anyone succeeds in this field, it is a fatal success. It kills the person. It kills all of those who indulge in this addiction. Just as is true of the particular areas upon which attention is focused these days. Oh, we have a terrible problem of drug addiction, and now alcohol. Oh. Yes, it's a problem, all right, but it's not a different problem to the problem of all human experience. It's all addiction, because there is this endeavor to fasten like a parasite on somebody else, to suck somebody else's life in order to fill one's own sense of void, one's own sense of loneliness. That is selfish, self-centeredness. Now, this is glorified in various ways as being the natural thing for man, very romantic at times and so on. But it's all hogwash. It's all an endeavor to avoid the necessity of being honest and coming again to the point of recognition as to the source of the filling of the void of loneliness in oneself. It cannot be filled rightly through anyone beyond oneself. When you begin to let it be filled in the right way from within yourself, then you are not being impelled into relationships with people in order to fill anything in yourself. In other words, it is not a self-centered thing. It begins to be a mature thing, because there is consideration as to the value of any particular relationship in the fulfilling of the purposes of life. Not the individual idea of purpose that may be in the person, but the actual purposes of life. Because life has a purpose. You wouldn't exist if it wasn't so. It produced you. For what purpose? So that you could say, oh, goody, I have life now I can use it for my purposes. But life produced you. And if you don't allow life to continue to produce its purposes for you, because of you, you isolate yourself from life, and you are very lonely. And then, oh, how can I assuage this terrible, gnawing loneliness within me? I must find somebody to do this. And various relationships develop on this basis. And we have a childish condition everywhere in the world. A condition of childish addiction. We have children playing with their toys. Now it's bedtime. Gotta let go of your toy. That's the way it is, isn't it, with children? Children become addicted to their toys. It may be all right up to a point with children. But gradually they need to learn to let go of them. Because even with children, the teddy bear or whatever it is trying to fill the void in the childish heart. And it can't be filled that way. It's more or less obvious one can't spend the rest of one's life with a teddy bear. or even a blanket. So usually the addictions change. The teddy bear is dropped and something else is taken up. But it still is an addiction. It is always an addiction if it relates to some external thing, with respect to which the individual would feel utterly desolate if it was taken away. Is there anything that can be taken away from you that would cause you to feel desolate? I'm sure the answer is in the affirmative. If that is so, then whatever it is in some measure at least being used by you to cover up your sense of aloneness. It indicates some area in you in which you are immature, some area which you have not allowed to be filled with what you are, the truth of yourself, so that your heart might be filled with the expression of love, not trying to get love from anybody, not expecting love from anybody, but your expression of love, and your mind filled with the truth, the right control and understanding of design as to the manner in which that love is properly expressed. And your body is filled with life. Life which reveals itself in health. When you are taking the responsibility for this, for letting your heart be filled with love, not from somebody else, but from within yourself, so that what you do, the way you act, everything that finds expression through you will be an enfoldment, a blessing, an understanding of the needs of others, to inspire others to let it be so with themselves, so that they may participate in this for themselves. It is the inspiration in the education which brings maturity in anyone. That you may, by your expression of the truth of love in living, reveal the way, the truth, and the life. That is what is meant by the way, the truth, and the life. There it is. And you do not feel lonely anymore, because you have an awareness, a consciousness deep within yourself that you are a part of the universal whole. That awareness may not be adequately informed yet out here in the experience of living. In other words, the relationships that are right on this basis may not yet have taken adequate form. But it isn't that which causes you not to feel lonely. I seem to recall something that Master said when he was on earth about his disciples forsaking him. He said, "You'll all forsake me and leave me alone." Alone in the external sense, but not really alone, because the Father is with me. My awareness of relationship to the universal whole is still there, regardless of what happens in the external sense. Everything can be taken away, as it was in his experience. Everything was taken away, but it made no difference to him. He was still himself. And when we learn to let these voids, which are there, undoubtedly there, because man has isolated himself from the whole, when we learn to let these voids be filled, then the sense of isolation and aloneness vanishes away. And we are in position to function intelligently and with maturity in our relationships with others. They're never based on an addiction. They are never such that we would be completely desolated if they were removed. Now, all human relationships will, sooner or later, be removed. Right? And so many people in life, or what they call life, go through successive experiences of desolation. Sometimes it becomes so devastating that the individual takes his own life, commits suicide. But whether he does it with a swift stroke of the razor blade or whatever, or whether he dies from natural causes, as it is said, it's all the same thing. A violation of the rules and regulations of life. Let us find again our burning interest in the art and science of living. Is it too much, do you think, just to have an hour or two a week for this study? In view of the fact that we have, well, several decades of living to do. Isn't it a peculiar thing how human beings will go along with education in all kinds of fields, but in the one central field where it is most important, they won't have anything to do with it? Which, of course, emphasizes the awful self-centeredness that is the overwhelming state of people everywhere. The art and science of living. Oh, ontology. People talk about ontology without having the faintest notion of what it really means. What is the art and science of living? Let us pass our examinations in this regard, so that we do not have this inbuilt sense of failure. We are examined. Every human being on the face of the earth is constantly being examined. And there is constant evidence of failure. And so it's not surprising if people feel that they are failures. This emptiness, this loneliness, this sense of isolation, with respect to each human being who is trying to live in his little cell, doesn't like it in there alone, wants somebody else to share it with him. This is the way to fatal addiction. It is not the romantic fulfillment that so many people suppose. The romantic fulfillment comes because there is a love of life, a love of what life really is. And when we discover this by living it, we find that fulfillment ourselves. And because we know the reality of fulfillment in this way, it is reflected in our external experience. The external fulfillment comes as a result of the internal fulfillment. How often we have said that the world around us is simply a reflection of what we are as human beings. If human beings look for external fulfillment, how would they find it? By manipulating external events? By coming involved with all these addictions? Of course not. But by experiencing the internal fulfillment. When that is known, it's reflected externally. Then it's right. Then it's life. Not a decreasing experience of existence, where the most vibrant time of experience is in the early years. And then the good wine runs out. In the true state of the marriage feast, the good wine is kept to the last. An interesting situation completely unknown by human beings, because they've squandered everything in riotous living. Riotous living, that is uncontrolled. Uncontrolled by the rules and regulations of life. Life goes. But here we see the value of the sense of loneliness. It is most valuable, because it may, if we will let it, turn our attention to the art and science of living. And when it does that, there is the answer. There the emptiness is filled. And it is one's own experience. It is not dependent upon somebody else. And that is success. That is victory. If you have to depend upon somebody else to fill it up, that's failure. Utter failure. And maintaining the childish state with the teddy bear. So let us accept the opportunity of participating in the true education. We'll only participate in it if we are interested in it. Nobody learns very much at school if they're not interested in the subject. And some of the subjects in school are pretty dry and uninteresting. But unless one generates some sort of an interest, there's going to be failure. And one can generate an interest in anything. But why should it be so difficult to generate an interest in living rather than in dying? Because human beings' interest is almost entirely centered in the processes of dying, in doing the things which bring disease, death, and disaster. The 3 Ds. So living is available to anyone, and we have at least 2 educational sessions a week in this regard. How much interest is there really? how much addiction. All addictions are dissolved by coming to know oneself, by reaching the experience of what has been called true identity. Very often people see this, and they're delighted to see it. George Emery goes around lecturing everywhere, and everybody's all excited about it. But who does anything about it? Very, very few. Why? Because it interferes with the accepted experiences of dying. So this morning, I draw your attention to the true education in the art and science of living. Let there be interest here, and we will live. O Lord, how neglected Thou hast been. Perhaps not neglected in the imagination of many from time to time, but in experience, virtually nothing. Because people everywhere have been intent upon trying to assuage their emptiness by preying upon each other. We are most thankful that we have the opportunity, an opportunity not yet granted to the vast majority of the population, to understand the opportunity to come to know the truth of living, the art and science of living, that we may be restored to the experience of ourselves, relinquishing the addictions, that all things in our experience may be brought to Thee and included in the unfoldment of the creative design as it finds focus here, a part of the universal whole. We are thankful for this opportunity, O Lord, and would surely be honest enough to accept it in the Christ. Amen. Yes, everyone is adequate in fact, but not necessarily in experience. We need to have the experience. Perhaps there has been some recognition of the fact of addiction in the world, and the endeavor to combat it has been related to what is called sacrifice. We have to make many sacrifices to be a good Christian, for instance. In other words, the idea is to dispose of our addictions. We can't dispose of our addictions. The addictions can be allowed to pass away to the extent that we are doing what is required in the first great commandment, or what is described by that commandment. When our concern is with life, with the art and science of living, and with the quality and character of that living, and what it is that we have to offer into our immediate field of responsibility. When this is paramount, then addictions no longer exist for us. The things that were addictive before are simply not factors of consideration. They do not claim control at all, because we are so busy doing what we're here to do as an expression of life. And in the expression of life, the elements of addiction simply dissolve. We don't have to sacrifice them. The idea of sacrifice has been useful because it made the person feel very self-righteous. Well, I've made so many sacrifices. Well, we make what may seem to those who are addicted as sacrifices, but to us they are not sacrifices because we're not addicted. It would only be a sacrifice if we were addicted. But in view of the fact that we accept the truth of living into our experience, I suppose in a sense you could say we're addicted to life, then all other elements of control cease to have any effect or dominion over us. So, where's the problem?
Yes, thank you, Martin. Let us all give our attention to the true education in the art and science of living, so that we may live. I love this piece, and I want to take us back through this little journey that Martin took us on, just to remember all that he shared with us. So he starts out, obviously, with the art and science of living as a form of education. And if we approach that the same as we did some other form of education through schooling, and introducing this idea that life has specific rules and regulations, and that if we ignore those, then what results from that is what he called the 3 Ds: disease, death, and disaster. Now, Martin doesn't say here in the beginning exactly what the rules and regulations of life are. However, it reminds me of Yoronda referring to the one law as a stable point with which you can always orient to and rely upon. So anyway, he moves forward, explaining that much like inside of a classroom where you are examined and you have to go through exams, life itself is constantly putting us through examinations. He says that human beings on the whole have a sense of failure within ourselves and don't even really recognize where that's coming from, but it's uncomfortable. So we try to get rid of it, the sense of failure. Essentially, this feeling comes from the state that we find ourselves in, which is separated from the universal whole. In fact, all of mankind has isolated itself from participation and connection to the whole of the universe of God. And because of that, man experiences an emptiness and a loneliness and this like void that he always is trying to fill from the outside, usually through relationships with other people, where we're actually using the other person to try to fill this empty space, this loneliness within ourselves that we experience because of this overall human condition of being separated and disconnected from our source, from God. Now, he's also saying that there is a correct relationship. There is a proper relationship and orientation that we should have. But that needs to be restored, as it's not present now. And the fact that it's not present creates a sense of isolation, which leads to loneliness. And the idea that we're trying to find someone or something to fill the void, instead of looking within to fill the void. And in that way, he calls human beings mutually parasitic, because we're just all doing that to each other and calling that relationships. Relationships and friendships. So he states a critical truth that if you are experiencing emptiness, loneliness in you, it can only be filled by you, not by anybody else. And this is like one of the first principles, I think, here in the art and science of living. Martin is saying that we can choose all sorts of things to try to fill that void, but they all end up becoming addictions. And he specifically refers to the human concept of love, where we're in this mutually parasitic relationship and experiencing that as the other person being able to fill our sense of loneliness. And then we call it love, when it's actually really more of an addiction. And it's a childish state of using others. Unfortunately, in the state of the world as it is, most people are doing it, and most people are unconscious and unaware that that's what they're doing. But sometimes people wake up. But regardless of whether it's using others through relationships or a drug addiction or alcohol addiction, and those are the main addiction areas, all of it is addiction of turning to something outside of ourselves to try to fill some space of emptiness that comes from the separation from God and being part of one whole working universe of creation and our connection within it. And when we're separated, that leaves a mark. But only turning back to that point within ourselves can actually fill that. Everything outside of ourselves that we try to use to fill that space just becomes an addiction, because it's only ever a temporary result. So yeah, we have a lot of addictions as humans. It's true. And so often as humans, what he's saying is that we live our life according to our own purposes rather than the actual purposes of life. With life as akin to God as a universal intelligence that has created all of this creation and has a purpose for every part and piece, including ourselves. And so without saying free will, he's going into this idea of how we, with our own self-active mind, go out and live our lives the way that we want to, from however we decide, rather than actually taking a moment to listen and surrender to a higher knowledge. And that is also part of the art and science of living. And unless we do that, we'll just continue to have addiction, childish addictions, and trade them out one for another, because the void is still there unless we truly turn within. And so Martin tells us that when we move into that space, the addictions pass away. They just drop away all on their own by letting our heart be filled with love, not from someone else's love, trying to get something out of a relationship, but love from within ourselves, so that that love radiates through us, out into the world, through our expression, through our presence, through our words and our actions. And he says that's what is meant by revealing the way, the truth, and the life. Your awareness, your consciousness has then expanded into a cosmic encompassment of the universal whole. So we are to recognize that there is a void, within each of us, not to fill it with an addiction, but to turn within to let it be filled. And then all the addictions, all the false patterns just fall away. And that's the space that we're starting in already, with a violation of the rules and regulations of life in human consciousness. And because of that, some people, it's too much and they can't take it on. They might turn towards suicide. But the answer, as Martin's proposing here, is to approach the art and science of living as an education, to dedicate, a couple hours a week at least for this study. We've been living for several decades, and how hard is it really to just give some time and attention out of our busyness in order to learn more, expand our consciousness, increase our wisdom around the art and science of living. Like, it's so funny because as long as you're alive, you're going to be experiencing the art and science of living. There is the argument that you could be dying the majority of that time because you're violating the laws of living. But still, the opportunity is there to live dynamically, radiantly, the way that we were designed. And yet, the mass consciousness as it is continues to show evidence of failure in the art and science of living, because the majority are still expressing as dying souls. And those are just my words and Yolanda's words. Martin didn't say that here, but he's saying that we're constantly being examined and there's constant evidence of failure. So it's not a surprise that people feel somewhere inside inherently like they're failures, and then go looking outside of themselves for some sort of external source of fulfillment. But the only fulfillment comes from an internal place, from a reflection on who we are, what we are as human beings, our divine identity. So if we look in that direction, the emptiness, the void, the loneliness, the addictions, all that stuff just drops away. Because when we restore our own true rightful place as divine beings, then there is no more hole, and there is no more need to conjure all these different things to try to fill it. We are naturally whole, as we naturally are. And from that place, we're oriented towards life, not the orientation of the 3Ds as he started out here, with disease, death, and disaster. That's the result of living out of the state of separation that experiences isolation and the loneliness and the hole, and trying desperately grabbing to try to fill it from outside of self. That will lead to the 3Ds, but we don't have to be that way. And because we know better, we have choice. And with that choice, we can provide an example, and we can provide a true education in the art and science of living, so that we and others shall live, revealing the glory of life and life more abundantly through our living. I hope you have enjoyed Martin Cecil's The Art and Science of Living. If you want to read this piece, it can be found inside of a book called On Eagle's Wings. It's been a pleasure to go through his teachings and share these materials here with you in this way. May we each know the glorious truth of who and what we are, and live life to the fullest in every moment. Thank you, friends. Until the next time.